August 2010. A bus stops on a highway in northern Mexico. 72 passengers, migrants, heading north. Armed men board the bus. They don't ask for money. They don't ask for documents. They ask one question. Will you work for us? Most say no. The gunmen take them to a ranch. They line them up. They shoot them in the back of the head. One by one, 72 people, men, women, teenagers. When investigators find the bodies, they notice something. The killers didn't panic. They didn't rush. Every shot was precise. Every movement was coordinated. These weren't street criminals. These were trained soldiers. The organization was called Los Zetas. At its peak, it was the most violent cartel in the Western Hemisphere. Mass graves, public executions, bodies dissolved in acid. The men who built it weren't recruited from prisons or street gangs. They were recruited from Mexico's elite special forces, and those special forces were trained by the United States. Fort Bragg, North Carolina, home of Delta Force, home of the Green Berets, one of the most advanced military training facilities on Earth. That's where the founder of Los Zetas learned to kill. Fort Benning, Georgia, the School of the Americas, a training program funded by the CIA, approved by the Pentagon. That's where he learned to interrogate, to surveil, to build networks, to run operations. His name was Arturo Guzmán Decena. He was trained to destroy drug cartels. Instead, he built one. This is the story of how the United States government accidentally created the most violent cartel boss in Mexican history. And it starts with a decision made in Washington. Arturo Guzmán Decena was born in 1976 in Puebla, Mexico. There's nothing special about his childhood. No trauma that explains what came later. No origin story that makes sense of the monster he became. He was just a kid from a working-class family who decided to join the army. He enlisted in the Mexican military in 1991. He was 15 years old, too young technically. But the recruiters weren't asking too many questions. What they saw was potential. A young man who was faster than the others, stronger, more disciplined, someone who didn't flinch when the training got hard, someone who seemed to enjoy it. By 1994, Guzmán Decena had been selected for GAFE, Grupo Aeromóvil de Fuerzas Especiales, Mexico's elite special forces, the tip of the spear, the best of the best. He was 18 years old. Here's what you need to understand about GAFE. This wasn't just a Mexican program, it was a joint operation, funded by American dollars, trained by American instructors, built to American specifications. The Cold War was ending, but America still needed allies in Latin America, allies who could fight insurgents, allies who could maintain stability, allies who could do the dirty work that American soldiers couldn't be seen doing. Mexico fit the bill. Under agreements signed between Washington and Mexico City, GAFE soldiers were selected for advanced training at American military installations. Fort Bragg, Fort Benning, the School of the Americas, the same places that trained Delta Force, the same places that trained the Green Berets. Arturo Guzmán Decena was among those selected. What did he learn? Everything. Urban warfare, the art of fighting in cities, how to move through buildings, how to clear rooms, how to set ambushes in narrow streets, close quarters combat, fighting at distances measured in feet, knives, pistols, hand to hand, how to kill a man before he knows you're there, intelligence gathering, how to build informant networks, how to run surveillance operations, how to identify targets, how to track them, how to find them when they don't want to be found. Interrogation techniques, how to extract information, how to break a subject psychologically, how to make someone talk when they'd rather die. Communications, encrypted frequencies, tactical coordination, how to run multiple teams across a city without ever being detected. Helicopter assaults, precision raids, hostage rescue, counter-terrorism. He learned how to be a one-man army. and then he learned how to build an army of his own. The instructors at Fort Bragg later described him as one of the most capable students they'd ever trained. Disciplined, focused, relentless. They had no idea what they were creating. Guzmán Decena returned to Mexico in the late 1990s. He was a lieutenant now, one of the most highly trained soldiers in the Mexican military, capable of operations that few others could execute. A valuable asset. His mission was simple: fight the cartels, dismantle the criminal networks that were flooding America with cocaine, capture or kill the kingpins. He was supposed to be the solution. Instead, he saw something that changed everything. He saw the corruption, the payoffs, the commanders who took cartel money, the operations that were sabotaged from within, the informants who were exposed, the soldiers who died because someone had sold their location for a few $1,000s. He saw the low pay, $700 a month for risking his life, while the drug traffickers drove luxury cars and owned mansions. He saw the futility. Arrest a kingpin, and he'd be free in months. Seize a shipment, and 10 more would cross the border that week. Fight the cartels, and they'd just pay someone to kill you. And he made a decision. If the system was broken, he would break it his way. 1999, somewhere in Tamaulipas, a meeting was arranged. The details are murky. Intermediaries were used. Precautions were taken. But what happened in that room changed Mexico forever. On one side of the table sat Arturo Guzmán Decena, GAFE lieutenant, U.S.-trained Special Forces soldier, one of the most lethal men in the Mexican military. On the other side sat Osiel Cárdenas, leader of the Gulf Cartel, one of the most powerful drug traffickers in Mexico, a man who had clawed his way to the top through betrayal and murder. Osiel had a problem. His enemies were multiplying. The Sinaloa cartel was encroaching on his territory. The Mexican government was increasing pressure. American agencies were targeting his shipments, and his own security was vulnerable. He needed protection, not street thugs with pistols, not local gangsters. He needed soldiers, real soldiers, men who knew how to fight a war. The offer was simple. Leave the military. Join me. Bring your skills. Bring your men. In exchange, $10,000 a month. Bonuses for successful operations. Protection for your family. Cars, houses, women. Power beyond anything the military could offer. Guzmán Decena looked at the man across the table. He said yes. But he didn't just bring himself. That wasn't the deal. He brought an army. Over the following months, he reached out to his former colleagues, GAFE soldiers he had trained with, men he had fought beside, brothers in arms who shared his disillusionment. He made them the same offer Osiel had made him: the money, the power, the chance to use their skills for something that actually paid. Between 30 and 40 soldiers defected. The exact number is disputed. What isn't disputed is what they brought with them. Training from Fort Bragg, training from Fort Benning, training funded by the CIA and approved by the Pentagon, counterinsurgency doctrine, interrogation techniques, tactical communications, urban warfare, the entire curriculum of American Special Operations training, now in the hands of a drug cartel. They called themselves Los Zetas. The name came from their radio call signs. Z1, Z2, Z3. Guzmán Decena was Z1, the founder, the leader, the man who started it all. Before the Zetas, the Gulf Cartel operated like most criminal organizations. Bribes came first. Violence was a last resort. Bad for business, bad for attention. Guzmán Decena changed everything. He introduced military structure, ranks, hierarchy, chain of command, discipline. He organized the cartel's operations like military campaigns, supply lines, communications networks, intelligence gathering. He established training camps, not for gangsters, for soldiers. New recruits were put through physical conditioning, weapons training, and tactical exercises. They learned the same skills he had learned from the Americans. He created a counterintelligence unit, men whose job was to identify informants, track police movements, monitor government operations. The same skills the CIA had taught him to use against criminals, now used against the government, and he unleashed a level of violence that Mexico had never seen. The old cartels understood limits. Violence created problems. Dead bodies attracted attention. Attention brought police. Police brought the army. The army was bad for business. Guzmán Decena didn't see limits. He saw opportunities. Violence wasn't a last resort. It was a strategy. Rivals weren't just killed. They were tortured, mutilated, displayed. Bodies were left in public squares with messages carved into the skin. Heads were thrown onto dance floors. Corpses were hung from bridges. The message wasn't subtle. Work with us, or this happens to you. Police officers who refused bribes were assassinated. Journalists who asked questions were kidnapped. Politicians who resisted were threatened. Their families were targeted. Within 2 years, the Gulf Cartel had become the most feared criminal organization in Mexico. Their territory expanded. Their enemies fell. Their reputation grew. And at the center of it all was a man trained by the United States government. Every skill Guzmán Decena learned at American military installations was repurposed, twisted, weaponized against the very institutions that had trained him. Intelligence gathering. At Fort Benning, he learned how to build networks of informants to track insurgents. Now he built networks to track police, identify undercover agents, and locate rivals. His intelligence operation was more sophisticated than most law enforcement agencies. Interrogation. He learned psychological techniques designed to break terrorists. He used them on captured rivals, suspected informants, and anyone who might have information. Survivors described sessions lasting days. Most didn't survive. Tactical operations. He planned cartel missions like military campaigns. Reconnaissance first, then coordinated strikes. Multiple teams hitting multiple targets, encrypted communications, planned escape routes, contingencies for every scenario. Counter-surveillance. He knew how government agencies operated because he had operated as one. He anticipated their moves. He stayed 3 steps ahead. When the army planned operations against the Gulf Cartel, he often knew before the soldiers did. Everything the Americans taught him to do to criminals, he now did to everyone else. By 2001, the Zetas had become more than bodyguards. They controlled territory. They ran smuggling routes. They collected taxes from local businesses. They operated as a cartel within a cartel. Guzmán Decena continued recruiting, not just ex-soldiers anymore. Police officers, prison guards, local criminals, anyone with useful skills. He established training camps across Tamaulipas. New recruits went through weeks of conditioning, weapons training, tactical exercises, loyalty tests. The best was selected for advanced training. The same curriculum he had learned from the Americans. The knowledge spread, multiplied. What started as 30 defectors became an army of hundreds. The Zetas weren't just enforcers anymore. They were a military force, better trained than the local police, better equipped than some army units, more ruthless than anyone. March 2001. A moment that showed exactly what the Zetas had become. 2 American DEA agents were driving near Matamoros, tracking a shipment. Routine surveillance. Osiel Cárdenas spotted them, or someone spotted them for him. Within minutes, the agents were surrounded. Guzmán Decena and his men appeared. Armed, tactical, moving like the soldiers they were. They didn't just threaten the agents, they told them exactly how they would die if they didn't leave. They described the methods, the locations where bodies would be dumped, the messages that would be carved. The agents left. They had no choice. That confrontation made international news. A Mexican cartel had faced down American federal agents and won. The Zetas had announced themselves to the world, and somewhere in Washington people started asking questions. Who are these men? Where did they come from? How are they so well trained? The answers were uncomfortable. November 21st, 2002, Matamoros, Mexico. Arturo Guzmán Decena was eating dinner at a restaurant called La Balada. He had security. He always had security. But someone had talked. Someone had given up his location. Mexican army soldiers surrounded the building. A firefight erupted. When the shooting stopped, Guzmán Decena was dead. He was 27 years old. The man who had been trained by American Special Forces, who had brought those skills to the cartels, who had transformed the Gulf Cartel into a paramilitary organization, who had pioneered a new era of violence in Mexico, dead on a restaurant floor. But here's what matters. His death changed nothing. The organization he built was too big now. The skills he had transferred were too widespread. The men he had trained were too capable. Los Zetas didn't die with him. They evolved. After Guzmán Decena's death, leadership passed to Heriberto Lascano, Z3, another GAFE defector, another American-trained soldier. Lascano had been one of the original recruits. He had trained at the same installations. He had learned the same techniques. He shared the same ruthlessness. Under his leadership, the Zetas grew even more powerful and even more violent. He was joined by Miguel Trevino Morales, Z40, not a former soldier, a street criminal who rose through the ranks, but he had learned from the GAFE defectors. He had absorbed their tactics, their methods, their willingness to do anything. Trevino became known for one thing above all else: brutality. He didn't just kill enemies, he dissolved them in barrels of acid. He called it making stew. He bragged about it. He made sure everyone knew. The original Zetas had been soldiers who became criminals. The new generation were criminals who had learned to fight like soldiers. The combination was devastating. By 2010, the Zetas had outgrown the Gulf Cartel. They controlled their own territory. They ran their own operations. They had their own army, their own income, their own infrastructure. The Gulf Cartel's leadership grew nervous. The enforcers had become more powerful than the masters. The bodyguards had become rivals. Tensions escalated. Trust collapsed. Then the Zetas declared independence. The war that followed was the bloodiest Mexico had ever seen. Cities became battlegrounds. Mass graves filled with bodies. Entire towns emptied. The Zetas weren't just fighting for territory. They were fighting to terrorize, to dominate, to make sure no one would ever challenge them. August 2010, San Fernando, Tamaulipas. This is where the world saw what the Zetas had become. Zetas gunmen stopped 2 buses carrying migrants, men, women, teenagers from Central and South America. People heading north, looking for work, looking for a better life. The passengers were taken to a ranch. They were lined up. They were given a choice. Work for us. Become assassins. Become soldiers. Or die. Most refused. 72 people were executed, shot in the back of the head. Their bodies piled on the ranch. Men, women, teenagers. A year later, investigators returned. They found more graves, more bodies. The final count was 193 victims, killed for their vehicles, their money, their refusal to join, or for no reason at all. This wasn't random violence. This was policy. This was the application of military doctrine to civilian terror. This was the legacy of American training in the hands of men who had no limits. By 2011, the US government could no longer ignore what had happened. Intelligence reports documented the connection. Former US-trained soldiers in cartel leadership. American tactical doctrine used against Mexican authorities. Training manuals translated into Spanish. Skills funded by American taxpayers, now used to kill civilians. The classified term was blowback. The unintended consequences of foreign policy. The programs designed to fight drug cartels had helped create the most violent drug cartel in history. Publicly, officials distanced themselves. The training was standard. The defections were Mexico's failure. The corruption was Mexico's problem. But the facts didn't change. American training, American tactics, American money, now covered in Mexican blood. The original Zetas are mostly gone now. Heriberto Lascano, Z3, killed by Mexican Marines in 2012. His body was stolen from a funeral home before it could be examined. Miguel Trevino Morales, Z40, captured in 2013. He's serving multiple life sentences. He will die in prison. The organization splintered. Factions emerged. The Zetas Vieja Escuela, the Cartel del Noreste. Smaller groups with the same tactics and the same brutality. The violence didn't stop. It spread. Other cartels adopted Zetas' methods. The Sinaloa cartel built paramilitary wings. The Jalisco New Generation cartel became even more violent. The playbook, written by American-trained soldiers, became standard operating procedure across Mexican organized crime. Here's what no one wants to talk about. The United States trained Arturo Guzmán Decena. They taught him everything he knew. They gave him the skills that made Los Zetas possible. Did anyone ask what would happen if he switched sides? Did anyone build systems to track defections? Did anyone consider that $700 a month might not buy loyalty when cartels were offering $10,000? Did anyone imagine that the skills being taught could be turned against the very institutions providing them? The answer, apparently, was no. No one asked. No one planned. No one prepared. And thousands died because of it. The United States still trains foreign soldiers every year in dozens of countries, special forces from Africa, commandos from Asia, elite units from the Middle East. The training is advanced, the tactics are lethal, the skills are transferable, and the same vulnerabilities exist today that existed when Guzmán Decena defected. Low pay, corruption, criminal organizations willing to pay top dollar for military skills. Have the lessons been learned? Have the safeguards been built? Or are we waiting for the next Arturo Guzmán Decena to emerge? From Africa, from Asia, from anywhere the skills are taught, but the institutions can't hold. Arturo Guzmán Decena died in 2002. He was 27 years old, a soldier, a traitor, a cartel boss, a monster. But before he was any of those things, he was a student at Fort Bragg, a student at Fort Benning, a student of American instructors teaching American tactics funded by American taxpayers. He learned his lessons well, and then he used them to build an empire of blood. The rise of Los Zetas wasn't an accident. It wasn't random. It wasn't unpredictable. It was the result of decisions made by governments who never imagined those decisions could backfire. It was the result of training provided without safeguards. It was the result of assuming that loyalty, once purchased, would last forever. They were wrong. The cartel boss, who was secretly trained by the CIA, is dead now. His empire has fractured. His successors are imprisoned or buried, but the violence he unleashed continues. The methods he pioneered are still used. The questions his story raises remain unanswered. And somewhere, right now, another soldier is being trained. Another soldier is learning the same skills. Another soldier is wondering whether loyalty is worth $700 a month. And no one is asking what happens if he says no.